Good morning and welcome to the forum at St. Bart's. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the Associate Rector for Formation and Liturgy here. And it is my delight to welcome you to this conversation with the Reverend Dr. Miguel de la Torre. He is the Professor of Social Ethics and Latinx Studies at Iliff School of Theology in Denver, Colorado. He's a leader in the field of liberation theology and ethics and a prolific scholar who's the author or editor of dozens of books. His latest is called Decolonizing Christianity, Becoming Badass Believers. It's a follow-up to his 2018 book, Burying White Privilege, Resurrecting a Badass Christianity. And he has two more books coming out next month, as well as another book by the end of the year. So he is definitely prolific. Professor de la Torre, thank you for getting up early and joining us from Denver this morning.
It's my pleasure to be with you all, and thank you so much for the invitation.
It's great to have you here.
Good. Well, I like to begin by making a very clear and bold statement, and that is that all manifestation of white Christianity and enlightened Eurocentric philosophy and theology and their movements are detrimental, if not deadly, to communities of color. You see, when the French during the Revolution gave us the term liberté, égalité, and fraternité, they were liberals and progressive, but yet that slogan was still damning to the colonized people in Vietnam, Haiti, and Algiers. For you see, liberty and equality and fraternity were not meant for the colonized people, for people of color. Liberation was only meant for French Europeans. When I was a small boy, saying the Pledge of Allegiance and came to that last sentence, and liberty and justice for all, even as a small Latino boy, I knew that did not apply to me. That was not meant for me. So I want to begin by saying that the jargon, the rhetoric of liberty and justice were never meant for people of color in this country. Therefore, to insist on embracing Eurocentric Christian thought works against the very interests of communities of color. The first step I want to argue to truly finding liberation is to embrace the hopelessness of that situation that we are left out. I took a group of students to Cuernavaca, Mexico a few years ago. And we visited the squatter villages in an area called La Estación, in where people actually has built huts in old abandoned railroad station land. And I remember afterwards, the group of students got together and we began to unpack everything we saw that day. And one particular white student came up with a comment of, I saw the misery all around us, but when I looked in the eyes of the little girl, I saw the hope in her eyes. At that point, I had an epistemological meltdown, because what I responded was, I'm not quite sure what you saw in her eyes, but within the next 5 to 6 years, she's going to be turning tricks to put food on the table, or at best, be in an abusive relationship. You see, for that little girl, for her children and her children's children, there really is no hope, because they are stuck in these global neoliberal structures that are designed to oppress her, so that those who are privileged, those who are called by God, can live a life of luxury. So I am advocating for the embracement of hopelessness. And I know that's a tough sell, because the gifts of the spirits are supposed to be what? Love, joy, peace, and hope. We keep telling ourselves Romans 8:28, that all things work for good for those who are called according to God's purposes. So to come out and begin to diss hope could be seen as problematic. But hope has been constructed, I believe, as a Eurocentric middle-class white privilege. In Spanish, the word for hope is esperanza, which comes from the word esperar, to wait. So when we in Spanish say hope, esperanza, there's an element of waiting in where we're not quite sure what we're waiting for. I'm sure that many individuals listening to me this morning heard some preacher give the analogy of the starfish. And for those who are not familiar, it's a cute little parable about a storm that occurs and the beach is littered with starfish. And there's a little girl throwing all the starfishes back into the ocean. And there's a grumpy old man who sees this and says, "You can't save them all." And she picks one up and says, "I'll make a difference in this one," and throws it in the ocean. And the congregation goes, "Ah, isn't that beautiful? We could make a difference in one life." The problem with that is, number one, I'm the grumpy old man on the beach. And number two, we celebrate the one who makes it so that we could ignore the thousands of other starfishes that are dying on the beach. Every year, 25,000 children die of hunger and preventable diseases in the world. I'm sorry, not every year, every day. Today, 25,000 kids will die. Tomorrow, 25,000 children will die. The next day, 25,000 more children will die. But we pick up the one that doesn't, the one that we send money to and save and say, look, we saved one. We made a difference in the life of one, so we could ignore the other 24,999. And by providing the hope that we can make a difference in one life, we can therefore feel good about ourselves in ignoring the other 24,999. What I'm arguing for is the other that we ignore. Because as much as I want to have hope, the rotting flesh is literally choking the hope out of my nostril to the point that I cannot breathe. Moltmann, the prophet of hope, believes in a God who keeps promises. That's why we have hope. We could say we have hope because God will always keep God's promises. That's one of the things we tell each other. But one thing that the Holocaust has taught us is that God doesn't always keep God's promises, specifically to the Jews. This was the whole argument that Primo Levi wrestled with, in where he comes out with, there is no God, only Auschwitz. In other words, he realized the hopelessness of the Holocaust. A God who did not appear, to the point that even God was held on trial for failing to keep God's promise to God's chosen. So what do I do with a God who fails to keep God's promises? See, I can have hope as long as I know that there's going to be a future. But what hope instead does is that it domesticates me so I do not rebel against the structures of oppression. If you walked into, I went to Auschwitz, and when you walk into Auschwitz, there's a sign over the main gate that says, "Work will set you free." That is a statement of hope. It is a statement that if you work hard, if you play by the rules, if you do what you are told to do, you will be free. You will survive this. Now, we all know that that did not work out. That regardless of the amount of hope the individual walking through that gate may have had, it is a high probability they ended up in the gas chambers. So hope serves the purpose for those who are oppressed to domesticate themselves so they don't make waves. If I keep my head down, if I don't make waves, if I do what I'm told, I might survive this. And what I'm arguing is you will not. Therefore, if we recognize this and we embrace that hopelessness where we have nothing to lose, that's when we become the most dangerous and the most radical. Hope prevents radicalization. Realizing it is hopeless propels me towards praxis based on the fact that I have nothing to lose. My people are already dead. Therefore, there is nothing more to be lost. Vanity of vanities tells us, the teacher, absolute fertility, everything is meaningless. We forget that verse of scripture. But I think for those who are marginalized, for those who are disenfranchised, for those who are dispossessed, for those who are disinherited, this is true. The reason why I embrace hopelessness is because of my radical solidarity with the least of these. I choose not to paternalistically recite Romans 8:28 that everything's going to work out, but instead, I choose to sit with the most hopeless individuals of the planet in the dust, sitting with Job, not understanding why these horrible things are occurring, becomes an act of radical solidarity. My people are living in the Saturday. The only thing that they know is the crucifixion of Friday. And there may be some idea that a resurrection may occur on Sunday, but we're not there yet. I find it interesting that many churches spend a whole year preparing for Easter Sunday and ignore the Saturday of hopelessness, where the vast majority of people live. We should spend more time in solidarity with those who live in the Saturday, those whose children are in cages on our southern borders, those who are mourning the killing of their loved ones by police because they were driving while under the influence of being Black or Latino or Indian or whatever. I have to read the biblical text through the eyes of the marginalized, which then asks difficult questions that Eurocentric Christianity, through its rhetoric, glosses over. For example, in the midst of this hopelessness, where is God? With Jesus, sometimes we have to realize that this God is absent. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Now, of course, what Christians like to do is to try to save God from God. And we come up with all kinds of interesting theories like God cannot look at sin, therefore God was not present when Jesus was being crucified because Jesus was personifying all the sin of the world. Yeah, that doesn't really match with our understanding of what God is supposed to be. I mean, God cannot look at something. I mean, think about that argument for a moment. God is so Puritan that God cannot look at sin, lest God faints because it's just overwhelming for God. If that's the case, that's a very sorry and weak God. More is going on there that I have no idea. I'm not a theologian, although some of my best friends are. I'm an ethicist. And as an ethicist, I'm trying to figure out, where was God? Where is God in playing a very sadistic role with Job? I mean, look at this story. Satan comes to God and says, I'm a gambling man. I bet you I could make Job curse you. And God apparently is also a gambling man, or says, sure, I'll take that bet. So God allows Satan to do all these horrible things to Job, wipes out all his children, all his wealth, everything. And then for 56 some odd chapters, we're trying to figure out why And at the very end, what does God finally give us the answer? I'm God, I do whatever the hell I want. How dare you even question me? That's not very satisfying to me. It's very frustrating. And now, again, we try to save God from God and say, well, God blessed Job with new wealth and greater lands and more cattle and more children. But anyone who ever lost a child knows that no matter how many more children you have, it will never replace the trauma of that original loss. You see, one of the things that we forget as Christians is that God has a dark side. Isaiah tells us, if good and evil visits the city, is it not I, God, who sends it? I mean, let's think about that for a second. God sends good and evil. In 1 Samuel, it tells us God sends evil demons unto Saul. God is sending evil spirits to Saul. I don't understand that. I really don't. I don't understand these passages. They do not match up with the Eurocentric theology I've always been taught. But what it does do is that it forces me to wrestle with Scripture in a more honest way, realizing I may not understand it, but that the simplistic answers of Eurocentric Christianity are not enough. So, what I am calling for is really a badass Christianity. And for those who read the book, notice there's a few curse words here and there, and the vulgarity of it, and people probably are very upset of how vulgar it may appear. But let me be honest with you. What is vulgar is children in cages, not the language I use. Matter of fact, the language probably best explains the vulgarity of our children in cages. So this badass Christianity rejects easy fixes. It rejects a Eurocentric explanation to how we understand life and how we understand divinity. This badass Christianity is not based on despair, but rather on desperation. And there's a difference between the two words. Despair, I roll up in the fetus position, I grind my teeth, and woe is me, I'm paralyzed to do any action. Desperation realizes that I'm going to die anyway, so I might as well cross that desert where I may also die. That's desperation. And once our people embraces that desperation, that's when we can begin to move the mountains. This badass Christianity really is not interested in theological questions about the existence of God. One of my philosophical mentor, Miguel de Unamuno, talks about understanding that there is no way we could ever prove there is a God. And there is no way you could ever prove that there is not a God. This idea of God is beyond the ability to prove and disprove. And while Eurocentric theologians are very good in coming up with all these proofs for God, that's really nonsense. Because at the end of the day, God can neither be proved nor disproved. So Miguel de Unamuno says, we might as well believe. There's more benefit in that than not believing. And in a way, that is what faith is. Faith is believing when there's no proof to believe. So in a very real sense, faith is believing in the God who may not be there. It is believing in what may not even exist. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if God exists or not. Now, don't get me wrong. I believe in God. I picked out my mansion in heaven. I'm all set. But even if there is no God, even if there is no heaven, that will not change how I live my life towards the core of justice. I do justice work not because I'm going to get an extra ruby in my crown when I get to heaven. I do justice work not as a transaction, that if I do this, I'll go to heaven. I do justice work because it defines my very humanity, and it defines the faith that I claim to possess. So whether there be a God or a heaven is unimportant to me. I live my life in the faith that there is, even if there isn't. And I think that's the foundation of this badass Christian faith that I am calling for. So neoliberalism has won. I mean, oppression will continue. Black lives will not matter 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, even a generation or 2 generations from now. Our racism and our ethnic discrimination will continue for generations. Once I realize that, I begin to realize it does not depend on me. I am not the savior of the world. I am called to be faithful to what I believe, and that's it. And it prevents me from burning out, and it prevents me from losing my drive to continue this fight for justice. So what is the ethical response? Let me wrap this up so we get some questions. We must now go to the police department to get a permit from the police department to protest the police department for police brutality. We have domesticated even how we protest. We must refuse to follow the rules set by the rule makers who created the rules to keep us powerless in the first place. I once spoke to a Chiapa rebel who told me that when he first began to demand land rights, he went to the bureaucracy and they looked at him and says, you smelly Indian, get out of here. So he showed up the next day with an AK-47. He says, you know what, they listened to me. Now, I'm not calling for violence, don't get me wrong. But what I'm saying is, once I stop following the rules, that's when new opportunities may emerge that might move the fight for justice a little closer to the goal, realizing the hopelessness that we may never get there. What I'm calling for is and I wrote this in several of my books, is an ethics para joder, which probably I shouldn't be saying that on a Sunday church meeting. But for those who don't know Spanish, joder is a certain Spanish word that is equivalent to an English word that begins with F and ends with K and is 4 letters long. And what I'm calling for is this badass Christianity must be a Christianity based on a praxis that screws with the dominant culture and the systems that dominant culture creates. It is a type of ethics that overturns the tables of the temple like Jesus did. Now, maybe in the question, if somebody asked me, what's my motto, I would talk about the young lords in New York and how they screwed with the systems to bring about justice, because that becomes the model that I begin to use. And this is an ethics that attempts to play the trickster, which is a very strong symbol in marginalized communities, whether it be Bear Rabbit and Bear Bear in the African-American community, Cantinfra in the Mexican-American community, Pepito in my own Cuban community, or El Egua, the Afro-Cuban trickster from the Yoruba Orisha traditions, which is also very live in my community. So this badass Christianity is based on how do we ethically screw with the structures that are designed to screw us. I'll stop there and I'll be happy to answer any questions you all may have.
I encourage you to send in your questions for Professor De La Torre using the live chat function on YouTube, the comments function on Facebook, or you can simply email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. That's pthompson@stbarts.org. Professor De La Torre, you used the term Eurocentric quite a bit in your remarks. I'm wondering if you could just define that a little bit for us and tell us how Eurocentrism often manifests in kind of white mainline Christianity.
Good question. By Eurocentrism, I really am talking about the philosophy in Christianity that really develops with the rise of the Enlightenment period. You could begin with Descartes, with I think, therefore I am. And the development of this hyper-individualism that we see not only in Eurocentric philosophy, but also in Eurocentric Christianity. So, for example, in this Christianity, you have Jesus has a plan for my life, and if I accept Jesus, I will go to heaven because Jesus has called me. Okay, again, the emphasis is on the individual. It's on me, and me. More communal understanding of Christianity, one that is not Eurocentric, which is very common in the African community, in the Latin American communities, in the Asian communities, is this idea that we as a community is how we understand ourselves. It's not I think, therefore I am, but rather because we are, therefore I can be. In other words, it's the community that defines us. So the idea that I'm going to go to heaven and my parents are going to hell because they didn't accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior is beyond comprehension. That's not heaven. That becomes a hell in heaven, knowing that my loved ones are suffering. So the community is what gets saved. It's not the individual. Now, this individualism, of course, plays out not only in religion, but obviously in politics. You know, I got my shot, so I'm not going to wear a mask anymore. You know, even though I may contaminate others, you know, who cares? It's all about me. A mask makes me uncomfortable, so I'm not going to wear one. So it's this hyper-individualism that undergirds this Eurocentric Christianity and Eurocentric philosophy. And of course, I will be remiss if I don't say another aspect of this Eurocentric thought is white supremacy, which we begin to see with the colonizing process of saving those unfortunate souls and bringing them civilization and Christianity, of seeing the other as less than. And I guess this begins with Hegel in his whole movement of history that begins, you know, with the least intellectual people until he reaches the apex, which happens to be central Germany, where Hegel happens to be living in. So you have this philosophical Hegelian construct that places whiteness, specifically Germanic whiteness, as the center and the height of human development. And that's also, and that leads, of course, to colonization. It leads to the genocide of others people. It leads to the slavery. It leads to all those other things as well. So when I'm talking about Eurocentric, it's a rejection of not only the individualism of that thinking, but also the colonizing undergirding that gives us slavery, capitalism, neoliberalism, and colonialism, and all those other isms.
Before we turn to audience questions, and I do encourage you all to continue sending them in via YouTube, via Facebook, or via email, I was struck, Professor De La Torre, there's a recent video of you on YouTube, which is titled something like, "Was Jesus a Racist?" with Brandon Robertson. And it's a provocative question. You tackle your book, the story of the Canaanite woman. I'm wondering if you can reflect a little bit on that, but also I was just struck by how much opposition there was to that video, how often it was voted down. Why do you think people are so resistant to asking a question like that?
Yeah. Well, when Jesus is defined as never making, an error, that Jesus is just total divinity, to even suggest that Jesus is wrestling with sin becomes blasphemy, which again goes against the entire scripture. I mean, you have Jesus being tempted in the desert, you have Jesus being tempted at Gethsemane. Why isn't Jesus tempted throughout his life? In fact, the book of Hebrews says Jesus was tempted in all things. Again, emphasize the word all. So the idea that suggesting Jesus was tempted becomes, blasphemous all of a sudden. But in that particular story, the Canaanite woman, we have to remember Jesus calls this woman a dog. And again, what is the word for a female dog? I mean, it's really a nasty thing that Jesus calls this, this Canaanite woman. And of course, we excuse Jesus, say, well, Jesus was testing her. But what I'm saying is, if I take my daughter to the hospital and they say, I'm sorry, our medicine is for good Americans, not for you Latinx dogs, and I complain, it says, oh, we were testing you. It's like, no, that doesn't work. You weren't testing me. But what I'm arguing is that Jesus, who is tempted in all things, was tempted by the racism, although racism wasn't used in that time, but by the supremacy of his own culture and looking down at the Canaanite people, what today we will call racism. And in that temptation, Jesus was able to learn something from this woman of color. Because up till that point, Jesus kept saying, only go to the house of Israel, do not go to the Canaanites. Only that salvation is only for the lost sheep of Israel. After he meets this woman, the message changes to go out to all nations, preach to everyone. So Jesus literally learns what Jesus' mission is from this woman of color. So that's what basically that sermon was about. And you're right. In other places, I can't tell you the amount of hate mail I received from that particular clip.
It was just remarkable how many downvotes there were, especially since your reflections were rooted in a portion of scripture we all know about.
Yeah.
So speaking of Jesus, a questioner asks if in kind of constructing this badass Christianity, this idea of badass Christianity, if you're at all inspired by Jesus's statement to be as shrewd as serpents and as innocent as doves.
Absolutely.
Is that inspirational for you?
Definitely. When I talk about an ethics para joder, it's really based on that verse. In other words, when you are oppressed, you can't exactly pick up a gun and go after the oppressors because they have all the guns, they have the police, they have the army, they have the missiles, and it becomes an excuse to wipe out your people. So you cannot, you have to be wise as serpents. You can't do a frontal attack on the oppressors because you will be wiped out and it becomes an excuse. So Jesus' comment of being wise as serpents tells me that how do I resist oppression in a way that doesn't excuse the killing of my people and myself? And this is where this trickster image comes in, because people who have been marginalized have historically been doing this. It's not, I'm not coming up with something new. This is the way the marginalized they've always been wise as serpents. They've always found a way to resist without necessarily having the full weight of the oppressor crush you. And gentle as doves. One of the one of the sayings that really impacts my thinking is by Cesar Chavez, who said, I am not a nonviolent man. I am a violent man trying to be nonviolent. And let me be very clear. The things that are being done to communities of color, they should burn down this entire country. I mean, if you kill your child, what would you do? in response. But we are trying not to be violent. We are embracing nonviolent and praying that we remain nonviolent. So don't mishear what I'm saying. I'm sure people will. I'm not calling for violence. I am recognizing the violence that already exists in me and the struggle not to give into it. But I will be honest. Touch a hair on one of my children, I'm not quite sure how I would react. And in the end, maybe the best I could do is ask for forgiveness if I react in a way contrary to the way I want to react. And this is real world struggles that oppressed people have. So yeah, gentle as dove, but wise as serpents.
A questioner quoting from your book asks what you mean when you say racism is not a belief, but complicity with an ideology.
I'm trying to remember where I said that in the book to try to get the context of it. But
page
if I'm sorry?
Wherever page 16 is.
So it's early in the book. Racism for me is more of an ideology. It's something that shapes my entire worldview. So even though I don't believe, even though I'm a good white person who believes racism is horrible, let's put it that way. Okay, now it's coming back what I meant and where is the book. The page 16 helped. So if I'm a white person, I march with Martin Luther King. I march with Black Lives Matter. I'm for the cause. I believe that racism is wrong. Okay. However, the ideology of white supremacy allows racism to function for me, even though I don't believe in it. Even though I'm against racism, the ideology of white supremacy will continue to benefit me against my will. Let me change it around a little bit. I'm a flaming feminist. I believe women should get paid the same as men. I wore those funny pink hats and protested against the abuse of women. So I'm with all the sisters. But at the end of the day, I'm going to be paid 25 cents more on the dollar than a white woman, 60 cents more than a Black woman, 50 cents more than a Latina woman. Sexism in our society is constructed to privilege my maleness, even though I don't believe in misogyny. You see what I'm saying? So in the same way that I am complicit with sexism, in a way, I'm even a recovering sexist, all white people are complicit with racism, even when they're against racism and don't believe in it. That's what that statement meant.
A white questioner wonders, do I need to hate myself in order to combat racism, white supremacy, et cetera, and is kind of reflecting on how difficult that is to do, loving oneself and also confronting whiteness.
Yeah. No, hatred is never the answer for anything. So hating self is not what's being called for. What's being called for is because of the love of white people, this person must become a traitor to whiteness. Because he or she wants to see the salvation of white people, they must deny the oppressive white supremacy. They must betray the power and privilege that whiteness provides them. In a way, they have to bow their knees to the Black Jesus, or the Latinx Jesus, or the Asian Jesus, or the queer Jesus. They have to follow the Jesus of the dispossessed and the oppressed against the satanic Jesus that has nothing to say about Black lives not mattering, about children in cages, about indigenous people in reservations, about Asian masseuse being slaughtered. So no, not calling for hatred, calling for a love that forces white people to betray the privilege and power whiteness gives them.
In the book, you have some messages to white progressives, white liberals, even though you spend a lot of the book also talking about conservatives. Can you talk a little bit about what white liberals, white progressives, what kind of questions they need to ask, what they need to confront?
Right. White progressive and white liberals sometimes are more damning than conservatives. And I say that because I know where conservatives are coming from. You know, they think I'm less than, and I get it. Let's not forget that when MLK writes that letter from the Birmingham jail, he's not writing the letter to George Wallace. He's writing it to the white progressive liberals who keep saying, you know, we got to wait. You're going too fast. In other words, all too often, white liberals and progressive wants to change society without really examining how they're privileged by society, or change how that privilege will continue in a new society. So there's always talk about moving slowly, about compromising, about give and take. And that is more damning, I think, sometimes to the movement than conservatives who just are against everything that we are doing. So I want to make sure that those who want to be allies don't get wrapped up in this thinking that they're the good guys because they have a Black Lives Matter sticker on their bumper sticker of their car. That to really be an ally, and again, let's take race out of it. For me to truly be an ally to women, or as a cisgender male to truly be an ally to my queer siblings, I have to use the power and privilege I possess in those areas to dismantle the very structures that are providing me with that power and privilege. And that's hard to do. It's easy to say, but I would suspect many may not really want to do it. So that's, I think, what the book is really trying to get at. In holding my white liberals and progressives' feet to the fire.
And this kind of connects to a concept we talked about last week in the forum with our speaker, Stephanie Spellers, about the stewardship of privilege. And that privilege is something that needs to be stewarded well. Mm-hmm. So there's a question about, you talked about hopelessness and embracing hopelessness. And there's a question about cynicism and how we avoid being cynical in the midst of the lies and hypocrisies of the church and the world. Is cynicism something we should avoid, or is it something we should embrace?
No, I mean, we need to be careful. When I say hopelessness, I realize that there are pitfalls. Hopelessness could lead to substance abuse. Because it's so hopeless, I'm going to find, why bother? I'm just going to drink myself, so I don't have to deal with the situation. But I think part of the reason why we sometimes may move to a more negative response to hopelessness, whether it be substance abuse, whether it be cynicism, is that we have been fed this diet that we can do all things, that it's all going to work out, that we believe, as Hegel will try to convince us, that history is an upward linear progression, that with each passing age, things get better and better and better. This utopian, of which both capitalism and Marxism are twins at birth, and believing this utopian, that we're all heading towards a final utopia, whether it be heaven, whether it be the Marxist classless society, whether it be the capitalist rising tide that lifts all boats, whatever that utopian is, we believe it. And then later, when we see that that's not happening, that instead there's a downward spiral, middle class downward spiral, we become cynical, we become abusive of substance to try to escape it. So when I'm talking about embracing hopelessness, I am calling for recognition that the structures are designed for our destruction. And once I realize that, and realize I can't change that, then I could embrace doing what I have been called to do, to try to move it towards more justice. And sometimes we may take 3 steps forward. Sometimes we may take 4 steps back. We don't know. Because there is no linear upward progression, the future may be more liberative and more justice-based. Or this, Trumpism may succeed, and we may have a Jim and Jane Crow 2.0. We don't know. The future is unknown. So the embracing of the hopelessness really is to propel us towards an action and a praxis that does not deliberate us, that does not cause us instead to be in despair. So I don't want to say that by hopelessness I'm automatically cynical. It does mean that I am more analytical and critical of the jargon and the rhetoric of both spirituality and political rhetoric.
So we have to stop very soon, but I'll fit one last question in there. People will say talking about racial justice, talking about social justice is divisive in church. What's your response to that?
The gospel message is divisive. If the gospel message is not divisive, then you don't have a church, you have a social country club where like-minded people come together and have a good time. The message of the gospel is divisive. Father against son, mother against daughters, brother against sister, I think is what Jesus said. It is meant to be divisive. The fight for justice is divisive as people hold on to their privileges. And quite frankly, any church that you go to and you leave feeling good about yourself, you might as well save the tithe money and join one of those self-help groups. It'd probably be more beneficial and more productive. So that's what I would say right off the bat. It's not that these issues are divisive to the church, they're just divisive to the social club. The true church knows and operates in the tension of that divisiveness.
Well, Professor de Torre, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us to really challenge us and confront us this morning. We really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure being with you all. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for having me.
And thank you all for watching. We hope you'll join us for worship at 11 a.m.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Professor de Torre. Really